The Huey was already running, and the next load was waiting. The pilots were up front. Men were moving toward the open doors. The rotor was turning fast enough to flatten the grass and throw dust across the landing area. To almost everyone standing there, the helicopter sounded exactly like a Huey was supposed to sound. The crew chief heard something else. Maybe it was a faint metallic note under the transmission noise. Maybe a vibration had moved from the floor into the seat frame. Maybe the rotor beat had picked up a small unevenness that had not been there on the last flight. He did not need the aircraft to become quiet. He needed one familiar sound to become unfamiliar. That was the difference. A passenger heard a Huey. A crew chief heard his Huey. And once he heard something wrong, the hard part was not noticing it. The hard part was deciding what to do while the pilots were waiting. The mission was still moving, and other men needed that aircraft back in the air. The title crew chief can sound like a supervisory job. On a Vietnam-era Huey, it was much more personal than that. In many Army aviation units, an enlisted crew chief was assigned to a particular aircraft. He helped keep it ready, inspected it, flew on it, worked on it after the mission, and learned how it behaved through hour after hour of use. He knew which panel buzzed without meaning much. He knew how the ship felt as the engine came up. He knew the ordinary shake in the cabin, the normal movement in the controls, and the small leaks or worn spots that needed watching even when they had not yet grounded the aircraft. That knowledge did not replace the maintenance manual. It made the manual useful in the real world. The paperwork could tell a mechanic when a component had been changed, how many hours were on it, and what inspections were due. The gauges could show rotor speed, engine speed, temperature, pressure, and warning lights. But none of those things could remember how that exact airframe sounded yesterday. The crew chief could. His work often began before the pilots reached the aircraft. A daily inspection could be performed after the last flight or before the next mission day, depending on the unit and schedule. Either way, somebody had to go over the ship closely enough to decide whether it was ready. That meant looking for evidence, not admiring the machine. Oil or hydraulic fluid where it should not be. A loose fastener, a cracked or chafed line, damage around the skids, a problem at the rotor head, a chip detector or filter that required attention. Wear around the transmission area, a control that did not move smoothly, a panel that had worked itself loose. The exact checklist changed with the model, the date, and the level of inspection. But the basic purpose stayed the same. Find the small thing before flight turned it into a larger one. Then, the engine started, and another kind of inspection began. A helicopter on the ground can look perfectly reasonable. Once it is running, loads move through the aircraft. Shafts turn, gearboxes work. The rotor system comes alive. The whole machine starts giving information through sound and movement. A crew chief standing beside the open cabin did not hear one clean mechanical note. He heard layers, turbine noise, transmission whine, the main rotor passing overhead, tail rotor noise behind him, loose equipment moving in the cabin, radios and voices coming through a headset, wind through the open doors, dust and debris striking the skin. The skill was not hearing everything separately. It was recognizing when the mixture changed. That could be difficult even on a calm flight line. Vietnam made it harder. Hueys operated from prepared airfields, rough strips, fire bases, clearings, roads, and landing zones where the aircraft might remain on the ground only long enough to unload, take on passengers, refuel, or receive another assignment. Heat affected performance. Dust got into machinery and worked against filters, bearings, and moving parts. Rain and mud created their own problems. Combat damage could be obvious, or it could leave a hole, dent, cut line, or stressed component that had to be found after the aircraft returned. And the aircraft were used hard. A lift ship might fly troops in the morning, carry supplies later, move wounded men, make repeated landings, refuel, and go out again. The crew chief was not watching a museum aircraft complete one careful demonstration flight. He was watching a working machine accumulate heat, vibration, dirt, and hours. That is why the relationship between the man and the aircraft mattered. Some veterans describe the ship as belonging to the crew chief in a practical sense. It was not his property, of course. The Army owned it, the pilots flew it, and maintenance sections handled work beyond what one crew could do. But he was the man expected to know its condition closely. In many units, he also flew aboard it as an aircrew member and gunner. If the aircraft had a problem in the air, he was already inside the machine he had signed his name to on the ground. One Vietnam account put the arrangement in plain terms. The crew chief maintained his aircraft and routinely flew missions on it. The logic was hard to miss. You worked on it, and then you flew in it. That produces a different kind of attention. When a crew chief checked a fitting or wiped a suspected leak clean, he was not preparing a machine for strangers. He might be sitting beside that same component within the hour. When he told the pilots a vibration had changed, he was not passing along a casual opinion. He was raising a question about the aircraft that carried all of them. Now, experience could be wrong. A loose cabin item could imitate a more serious noise. Rotor wash could change what a man heard on the ground. A vibration might appear only at one speed or under one load. Maintenance might inspect the suspected system and find nothing conclusive. That is where the job stopped being romantic. A crew chief could not simply say, "I know my ship," and expect the aircraft to remain grounded forever. He had to report what he heard or felt as clearly as he could. Where did it seem to come from? Did it happen during startup, hover, climb, level flight, or a turn? Was it steady or intermittent? Did it change with power? Could another crew member confirm it? Had anything recently been replaced, adjusted, or struck? The sound was only the beginning. The report had to lead to an inspection, a maintenance action, a ground run, or sometimes a test flight. A well-documented incident from early 1970 shows both the value and the limit of that judgment. A crew chief named Mike McGuire later recalled flying on a UH-1H that was not his regular assigned ship. His own aircraft was in the hangar for a tail boom change. While crewing the substitute helicopter, he heard a noise that he believed came from the transmission area. He reported it and placed a red X against the aircraft, indicating a serious condition that had to be cleared before flight. Maintenance personnel checked the problem. According to his later account, they discussed the chip detector and sent a fluid sample for analysis. The aircraft also had a reported high-frequency vibration that could appear and build. A maintenance test flight was scheduled to find the cause. The helicopter crashed during that test flight, and both pilots were killed. The surviving accounts do not give us a clean answer. One theory concerned a hydraulic hardover during an attempt to reproduce the vibration. Other recollections raise different possibilities. The later statements are not a final accident board conclusion, and they should not be treated as one. What they do preserve is the crew chief's warning. McGuire had spent enough time on that aircraft to hear something he did not accept as normal. Years later, he still remembered not only the noise, but the question that followed it, whether he had pushed hard enough when the first response did not satisfy him. That is a heavy memory, and it would be easy to misuse it. The lesson is not that a crew chief could diagnose a transmission by ear with perfect accuracy. He could not. The lesson is that an experienced man could recognize a change before anyone had identified its source. A changed sound did not tell him the answer. It told him the aircraft had asked a new question. And sometimes the only responsible thing was to stop the schedule long enough to answer it. That sounds straightforward until you put the mission back into the picture. A Huey might be needed to carry infantry to a landing zone, bring ammunition to a position, move a command group, or pick up wounded men. Another aircraft might not be available immediately. The pilots may have had confidence in the ship. Maintenance may have found no metal on a chip detector, no obvious leak, and no warning light. The pressure to return the helicopter to service was real because the need for helicopters was real. The crew chief stood at the uncomfortable point between two truths. The mission mattered, so did the machine. Good maintenance did not ignore urgency. It decided what urgency was allowed to change. A superficial problem might be deferred and watched. A loose item might be secured. A known vibration might be tracked within limits. A suspected drive system or rotor problem could not be treated the same way. The crew chief's job was not to ground the aircraft whenever he felt uneasy. It was to know when uneasiness had a physical reason. That reason often became clearer during flight. From the cabin, the crew chief could watch areas the pilots could not easily see. He could monitor passengers and cargo, look for leaks, notice smoke or unusual movement, and feel changes through the floor and structure. The pilots had instruments and flight controls demanding their attention. The crew chief had his own field of view and his own set of clues. He also had continuity. Pilots rotated among aircraft more often than many crew chiefs did. Practices varied by unit, and no single arrangement covered every Huey in Vietnam. But the assigned crew chief often spent long periods with one tail number. He saw the aircraft before the first mission, during the day, and after it returned. That last part may be the most important and the least visible. When the flying stopped, the work did not. One door gunner from the 1st Brigade Aviation Platoon of the 101st Airborne Division remembered returning after dark, cleaning the machine guns, helping the crew chief with the aircraft's daily maintenance, and cleaning the inside of the Huey. Then the next day began again. In the 162nd Aviation Company in the Mekong Delta, maintenance personnel described an operation supporting 23 UH-1 H-lift helicopters and 6 UH-1C gunships. Aircraft went through scheduled work, component changes, inspections, troubleshooting, and test flights while the company continued flying combat and support missions across the Delta. That is the part the simple image of one crew chief and his Huey can hide. He had a close relationship with the aircraft, but he was not working alone. Technical inspectors, engine specialists, sheet metal men, electricians, avionics personnel, maintenance officers, and test pilots all entered the chain. Parts had to be found. Records had to be kept. A damaged aircraft could become a source of components for others. Neighboring units sometimes helped each other solve problems or locate parts. The crew chief was the daily memory of the aircraft inside a much larger maintenance system. He knew what had changed since morning. After several sorties, he might see fresh fluid where an area had been wiped clean. A fastener that was secure before takeoff might show movement. A panel could have started working loose. A hit to the aircraft might require a careful inspection of the surrounding structure. If the pilots reported a new vibration, he could compare it with what he had felt in the cabin. If a warning light had flickered, the maintenance team could connect that report with the physical inspection and the aircraft records. Then came the decision about tomorrow. Some maintenance was routine and expected, some was unscheduled, some faults were obvious, others appeared, disappeared, and refused to repeat on the ground. A high-frequency vibration could be especially difficult because the aircraft might run normally until a particular combination of speed, load, control input, or component behavior brought it back. That is why test flights existed. They were not joyrides after repairs. A maintenance test pilot took an aircraft up to check systems, verify work, and reproduce discrepancies under controlled conditions when possible. The crew chief's report helped define what the test pilot was looking for. The report had to be specific enough to be useful and honest enough to admit what the crew chief did not know. "I heard a noise," was a start. Where, when, and under what condition made it maintenance information. The best crew chiefs developed that language through repetition. They learned the aircraft with their ears, but also with their hands and eyes. They checked for heat where heat did not belong. They looked at safety wire, fluid lines, mounts, blades, controls, and drive system areas. They watched what changed after a component was replaced. They listened during a ground run, and then listened again after the aircraft had flown. None of this made them infallible. It made them harder to fool with familiarity. Most people become less attentive to a repeated sound. The crew chief had to do the opposite. The more often he heard the aircraft, the more precisely he had to remember it. That is a strange kind of skill. A Huey was loud enough to overwhelm a newcomer. To an experienced crew chief, the noise could become organized. He knew what belonged there. The warning came when one piece no longer fit. Sometimes the wrong sound led to a loose bracket or a panel that could be fixed quickly. Sometimes a vibration required balancing, adjustment, a component inspection, or a test flight. Sometimes maintenance found no clear cause on the first attempt. The value of the crew chief was not that every suspicion became a dramatic failure. Most of the time, nothing dramatic happened because men inspected, reported, checked, repaired, and checked again. That ordinary result is easy to overlook. The helicopter flew, the troops arrived, the supplies were delivered, the crew returned. No one outside the maintenance line knew that a sound had delayed the aircraft or that a mechanic had opened a panel twice because the first answer did not feel complete. And there was another limit to what records can show us. A maintenance form can preserve a discrepancy and the corrective action. It may record a vibration, a leak, a component change, or a test flight. It usually cannot preserve the exact sound that caused a crew chief to look up. It cannot reproduce the difference between yesterday's transmission whine and today's. It cannot tell us which vibration came through the seat, which one came through the pedals, or which harmless rattle had fooled 3 new men before an experienced one learned to ignore it. That knowledge lived in crews, and much of it stayed unit-specific. One company might have aircraft with different modifications or different maintenance problems. An early UH-1D and a later UH-1H were not identical in every detail. Gunships and lift ships lived different working lives. Operations in the Delta did not punish an aircraft in exactly the same way as Highland flying. Dust, salt air, rain, heat, landing zone conditions, flight hours, and the supply situation all changed what men watched most closely. So there was never one magical Huey sound every crew chief in Vietnam was waiting to hear. There were many wrong sounds. A new whine, a knock, a scrape, a buzz that moved with rotor speed, a vibration that appeared at one power setting, a change in the tail, a roughness during startup, a noise that continued after a loose cabin item had been secured. The important part was not the name of the sound. It was the comparison. This aircraft today did not sound like this aircraft yesterday. That comparison came from the entire work cycle: inspection before flight, observation in the air, quick checks between missions, reports from pilots and gunners, maintenance after the last landing, and another look before morning. By then, the crew chief had done much more than listen. He had built a memory of the machine. That memory could not sign off a repair by itself. It could not replace a technical inspector, a test pilot, a manual, or a proper maintenance action. But it could catch the first change. And in a war that demanded repeated flights from heavily used aircraft, catching the first change mattered. Near the beginning, the Huey was running, and men were ready to climb aboard. Almost everyone heard an aircraft waiting to leave. The crew chief had to hear a decision. Was the sound normal for that ship? Had it changed since the last flight? Could he explain where it came from? Did it need a quick check, a longer inspection, or a red X that stopped the aircraft until somebody found the reason? The mission was waiting on the answer. So were the men getting aboard. There are former crew chiefs, gunners, pilots, and maintenance men watching who remember sounds no manual could reproduce. If you worked around the Huey, what was the one noise or vibration your crew learned never to dismiss? And was it common across your unit, or peculiar to one aircraft? Most people heard a Huey. The crew chief listened for whether his Huey was still healthy.